Hello, YouTube. I'm Andrew Does Hair. You can find my work on Instagram at Andrew Does Hair. I've been a hairstylist in Southern California for the last 20 years. These days, I've been splitting my time between Tustin, California and Nashville, Tennessee. So if you're in either of these places, I'd love to meet with you and do these things to your head. I wish I could say this was going to be a tutorial as far as how to assess and fix your own hair. However, in 20 years of doing this, I haven't been able to do these things for myself, and therefore I get negative comments about my own hair on the internet almost every day. But hopefully this just gives you something to think about, whether you're a professional who wants to go a little bit further into your consultation, or whether you're a client or a consumer who's just curious about what could go into getting a better haircut. Now, of course, these are all just my opinions. None of these things are rules or laws. They're just kind of guidelines. And essentially, I'm going to go through 10 points here that more or less I can cross-reference to extrapolate one or many hairstyles that might work really well for your head. Number one is the widest point of your head. This is called the parietal ridge. It's where your skull comes up and out to its widest point. This tells me a lot about how your hair can and should be cut. Anytime you have a longer top over a shorter bottom, which is most haircuts, you're going to have a point on the head where all the long hair piles up. And where anything piles up, it pushes outward. It'll change the silhouette of your haircut. So by looking at the widest point of your head, which I can find by feeling with my fingers or even looking at the head, and if I really have a hard time looking for it, I'll rock a comb along the side of the head to just see where it pivots off of the head. Now, on some people, this is very low, and on some people, this is very high. What I know is if I go over this point with a fade, it's going to have a little bit of a military look. And if I go too much under this point on a fade, it's going to have that kind of light bulb Jersey Shore look. And so this wide point is a key that tells me whether we're working with short hair or long hair, where the weight should pile up. And almost every haircut has some level of weight to it, but where it sits on the head is hugely dependent on where the widest point is. Number two, the curvature at the corners. So this is somewhat related to the last point, but it's very a mixed bag. If you have a very large, wide radius on the top of your head here, you can get away with much bigger hair before it looks disproportionate. If you have a very tight, small radius, then you can't get away with huge hair before it looks disproportionate. And so this curvature shows me essentially how big your hair can be before it looks wrong. Contrary to what most people would think, a lot of clients who know they have a sort of larger curvature here, they think a tighter, shorter haircut will be more suitable because they think it will make their head look smaller. But what I find is it's kind of like putting a small jacket on a larger guy to make him look smaller. If you have a big curvature here and a big head, then big hair kind of fits. Number three, the highest point on the head versus the hairline. So this high point on your head is what's called the apex. And on some people, it's not much higher than where their hairline is, where on other people, it is quite a bit higher. This gives me a little bit of a tip as far as how long we can go in the front before it looks disproportionate to the rest of the haircut. With a very high apex and a low hairline, you could do very tall hair without it looking wrong or off or too big or silly. And the same is true for the opposite. If your apex is not much higher than your hairline, then you can kind of get away with smaller, shorter haircuts, and maybe a crop might be a good fit for you. But looking at this shape here tells me a lot about what we can get away with. In some cases, it's something that could be compensated for. We can make the top of your head look taller or shorter depending on, how drastic the situation is. But being aware of this tells me a lot about what your hair can and should do. Number four, the occipital bone. The occipital bone is that large round bump on the back of your head. On some people, this sits a little bit high. On some people, this sits a little bit low. On some people, it's very prominent, and on some people, it's very flat. Being aware of it tells me a lot about how to cut your hair. If you have a somewhat average occipital bone, it's the perfect guideline to show me essentially how to cut the back of the hair. This is a regular traditional classic haircut is kind of designed off of this angle that is produced off of the bottom side of the occipital bone. But in cases where the head is flat, there are things we can do to make it look like you have a larger occipital bone as far as altering the haircut. And if you have a very large occipital bone, there are things that we can do to make it less prominent or to appear less prominent. We can build weight over the top of it instead of directly on it to sort of mitigate for the largeness of it. But being aware of this is a huge factor in deciding how we're going to cut the back of the hair. Number 5, the stand bend test. something that I do with just about almost every head in the chair. Sometimes I can just look at the hair and not need to do this. I'll just know what it's going to do. But in most cases, what I like to do is isolate a couple pieces of hair in some key areas. So the front of the middle of the forehead, a couple hairs on the side of the head. And what I'll do is see if the hair is willing to stand, see if it's willing to bend. And based on what the hair is acting like and how it's going to move, it can tell me a lot about how to cut your hair. And so this is where I'm factoring in the differences between your wave pattern versus the next guy, or your curl pattern, or how stick straight your hair is. I'm figuring out just essentially how rigid your hair is, because on some hair you can cut it to an inch and it'll lay back just fine. On some hair, you can cut it to 6 inches and it barely wants to lay back. And likewise, on some hair, if I cut it to an inch, it's falling flat and it's not standing up. But on other hair, I can cut it to 6 inches and it's going to stand straight up. And so at this point, I'm just kind of testing, again, the rigidity of the hair. I'm looking at how it bends under pressure. And at times, if I know we're going to go shorter, I'll cut it a little bit shorter and then retest the hair at a shorter length, because the shorter the hair is, the more rigid it is. And I want to take just this small isolated area, see how much volume it's willing to hold, see how freely it's willing to bend. And it's going to tell me a lot about what we can ask the hair to do later. In addition to doing this on the top of the head and sometimes around the crown or the cowlick, if they have a problematic cowlick, I'll take sections off of the side of the head. If we're doing a haircut that we're expecting to lay back, I'll take some hairs and I'll test them. I'll grab a section out of the side and I pull it out and feel it and bend it. I will bend it at its full length. If water's holding it back alone, then I'll be able to kind of grab it at shorter and shorter lengths, or maybe trim it down a little bit along the way and retest. And essentially, I want to find that threshold to where, hey, if we go any shorter than this, it's sticking out and it's not laying back. So the stand bend test tells me a lot about what your hair can do and should do. Number 6, what does the hair want to do? This is a little bit similar to the last test. However, what's different is this time I'm less isolating hairs and putting them in a vacuum chamber to see how they act individually. And I'm looking at the whole of the head. I'm looking for cowlicks, I'm looking for partings, and I'll kind of wiggle the hair. I'll scrunch the hair to see how aggressively it might curl or wave. I'll comb it flat to see if it bounces right back up to curl, or to see if it'll hold some flatness for a minute, because that tells me a lot about what it's going to do in the finished style. Another thing that I do, if I can't tell just looking at the head, I can comb the hair straight back. And then if I put my hands on the hair and push it forward, I'll see where it begins to want to split naturally, which can tell me where your partings are, where the natural parts are. Under this little bit of a stress test here, the hair is immediately going to kind of give way where it most naturally wants to. And so that gives me a good indicator as far as throughout the day, if you're trying to wear it back and eventually it splits, this is going to show me where it will eventually split. And by being aware of these things that the hair wants to do naturally, I can design a haircut that will fall into place naturally. You see guys in movies where they shake their head and the hair just falls right. That's because the haircut was designed around what the hair wants to do. Now, given this test isn't 100% accurate all the time, I might find that if I comb the hair back and push it forward, it's going to split in a couple different places. And so sometimes I'll do this 2, 3, 5 times on the same head, or in different areas on the head. If they know they want to part it on the left, I'll try it a few times on the left to find exactly where it wants to part. If they know they want to part it in the middle, I'll try it a few times near the middle to know exactly where it wants to part. But being aware of this, as far as the partings and the natural movement of the hair under like an overall general combing, and especially around the cowlicks and things, this is going to give me huge insight as far as what your hair can do, and more specifically what your hair is going to do at the end of the day, whether you like it or not. Whatever this test shows me is where you're going to wind up on the days you don't style your hair. Number 7, what will the hair allow us to do? Similar to the last test, I'm going to be moving the hair all over the head and looking at kind of the macro broad spectrum of what the hair wants to do. And essentially what I want to do is find a couple key places where somebody might want to part the hair, or find a couple directions that the hair doesn't naturally want to go. And I'm going to force it there. I'm going to push it in directions it doesn't really want to go. And I'm going to put it under just a little bit of stress. If I'm very careful, I can get every hair to lay nicely. But as you can see here, as I'm kind of whipping the hair over, there are a handful of hairs that just simply don't want to go over as easily as the rest. And as subtle as this is in this video, that's a huge indicator that if the client decided to part his hair right there, he would have problematic hair for the day. He might be able to hairspray it and blow dry it and get it to stay there temporarily, but at the end of the day, it's probably not going to stay there long term without hardcore styling. And so there are certain things that the hair is sure willing to do if you style it, and then there are even more things in some cases that the hair is willing to do if I style it. And that's not a statement about my skill, but just the fact that I've been doing this 20 years and I'm standing behind you so I can get a better vantage point on your hair. Knowing what the hair will let me get away with, which is the opposite almost of what it wants to do naturally. Like, what are the parameters of how far from what it naturally wants to do will it also do? I want to know those things because that's going to factor into what your hair can do and how it might be cut. Number 8, how much time do you want to spend styling? The answer to this is going to essentially refer me right back to number 6 or number 7 and finding a balance between the two. If somebody says, I want to style it some days but not other days and I need it to work all the time, I'm going to think a lot about 6 and 7. If somebody says, I like styling my hair, I do it every single day, we can lean into all the options that 7 provides. But if somebody says, I never want to style my hair, then we're ignoring 7 and going with 6. Number 9, how often would you like to feel like you need a haircut? There are people who love the routine of getting a haircut every 2 weeks. And there are people who wish they could go quarterly without haircuts or biannually. Knowing this about you tells me a lot about how I can cut your hair. Something that I actively do with every haircut is essentially what I'm kind of miming on the screen here. I don't physically do this with my fingers, but this is a way that I can kind of demonstrate what I'm doing mentally. When I'm designing a haircut, I will factor in what happens when this hair is 1 inch longer, which is 2 months of growth. What'll happen when this hair is 2 inches longer? And as you can imagine, for a very short, tight fade, if it grows a quarter of an inch, it's not the same haircut anymore. And so we have 2 weeks before a short, tight fade is not the same haircut anymore. But with a longer haircut like we see on the screen here, if it grows up to 2 inches, it can barely look any different. So some of the things that factor into this is like, if the hair grows downward against the head, we can go as short as we want. And as it grows back, it's going to continue to lay down because it grows down. But if the hair grows outward, say on the corners, if you want your hair to last a long time, we need those corners to lay down today. That way they'll lay down tomorrow, they'll lay down in 2 weeks, they'll lay down in 5 weeks, they'll lay down indefinitely until you come back. But if you want a haircut that's going to last a long time, I want to make sure that it's not going to stick out in 2 weeks anywhere. And likewise, if you want a haircut that's going to have a lot of volume in the front, I want to kind of imagine that piece in the front that I tested, if it was 2 inches longer, would it still stand up? And so this takes a little bit of experience. Like I've touched enough heads that I can have a kind of an educated guess on what it's going to do in 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. But this is absolutely a massive factor in deciding what kind of hairstyle should fit your head. Number 10, do you want to look like you tried to look good or like you accidentally looked good? If you think about it, every hairstyle you've ever seen falls into one or the other of these two camps. If I take all of the information that I've extrapolated from the last 9 points here, and then I filter it through this one last question, it just brings up a list of, okay, here's the hairstyles we can do and can't do. So some hairstyles you look at, you can see comb lines in it, you can see every hair sitting perfectly in place, and that has a very strong narrative to it. I woke up, my life was put together, everything was in place. I tied my tie perfectly this morning in a fancy knot that you don't know how to do, and I went to the office looking better than everybody, and I did it on purpose. That's a very different statement from I rolled out of bed and I didn't have to do anything. I just happened to look cool. Now, mind you, looking like you didn't try and actually not trying are two very different things. And we can give you cool hair that you literally don't have to try to do, but we can also give you cool hair that you can try to do but looks like you didn't try to do. But again, knowing this difference is going to help me to figure out how to cut your hair. Now, this is not as simple necessarily as just styling. There are ways that we can cut the hair to where it can be styled to match both narratives, but there's a lot of details in the haircut that can go one way or the other based on what you want the hair to say about you. Somebody with crispy, clean lines and nice faded tapers, I care to look good. I try to look good. And I don't want to do those things on somebody who says, well, I'm going to look like I happen to look good by accident. In a case like that, I might leave more disheveled edges, I might do more texturizing. I might leave things a little bit more or less unfinished looking. It's the idea of getting a haircut today that looks like you got a haircut a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And knowing what you prefer about the statement you put out about yourself, whether you want to look like you tried to look good or didn't try to look good, knowing about that tells me so much about how to cut your hair. I hope that this information was helpful. I hope it was inspiring. I hope it taught you something. If you got anything out of this video, please share it with somebody. That's so appreciated. I am new to the Nashville area. I'm trying to build a clientele out there. And so if you want to book with me, I'm probably wide open. Please check my Instagram for booking and availability or how to book and that sort of thing. Thank you.